You can't win.
Pierce Brosnan. For millions, the name instantly conjures up the smooth tuxedo, the martini glass, and the iconic line, Bond, James Bond. But behind that unshakable screen presence is a life story far darker, far more heartbreaking, and ultimately far more inspiring than anything Hollywood could have scripted. This is a man who rose from abandonment and loneliness in rural Ireland to dazzling stardom in one of the biggest film franchises of all time. But just when he thought he had it all, betrayal, tragedy, and devastating loss would strike him again and again. He was the hero who always won on screen, but in real life, he faced battles no spy could escape. Before we dive in, let me ask you, who is your favorite James Bond actor? Connery, Craig, Brosnan, or someone else? Comment below, because you may see Brosnan in a whole new light after hearing his true story. Stay with me until the very end, because the truth about Pierce Brosnan is not only about movies, it's about survival, resilience, and the enduring power of love. And it all begins, not in Hollywood, but in a quiet Irish town where a little boy learned the hardest lesson of all, what it means to be left behind. Long before Pierce Brosnan became James Bond, before the fame, the tuxedos, and the billion-dollar box office, there was only a small boy in Ireland and silence. He was born on May 16, 1953, in the town of Drogheda. His father, a carpenter, was gone almost before Pierce could speak his name. No accident, no dramatic farewell, he simply vanished. Pierce would later admit he never knew his father's face, never heard his voice. Imagine that, your very first role in life stripped away before you even had the chance to play it. His mother, May, tried to provide, but when Pierce was only 4 years old, she made a decision that would mark him forever. She left for London to work as a nurse, promising it would only be for a short while. But that short while stretched into 7 long years. 7 years in which young Pierce was passed between relatives. First his grandparents in Navan, then an aunt and uncle in Trim. Each home had its own rules, its own voices, its own walls that never felt permanent. For a boy that young, stability became a luxury he would never know. Pierce learned to survive in silence. He became the quiet child, the boy who stayed out of the way, who watched more than he spoke. Teachers noticed something in him, a brightness behind his eyes, as if he was searching for something just out of reach. When his mother finally returned in 1964, it wasn't just her. She came back with a new husband, William Carmichael. And for the first time, Pierce had something that almost resembled a family again. William wasn't harsh, he wasn't cruel. In fact, he was patient, gentle, and never tried to take another man's place. He taught Pierce how to fish, how to fix things, how to trust again. But here's the truth. About growing up with loss, even love feels fragile. For Pierce, it was as if any bond could vanish the moment he held on too tightly. And yet, fate was about to reveal itself, not in a classroom, not at home, but inside the dark walls of a movie theater. One night, William took him to see Goldfinger. Sean Connery filled the screen, larger than life, confident, untouchable, unshakable. And in that moment, something sparked deep inside the boy from Drogheda. Pierce thought to himself, that's the man I want to be. But here's the twist most people don't know. Acting wasn't Pierce Brosnan's first dream. In fact, his life was about to head in a completely different direction, one that had nothing to do with Hollywood. Stay with me, because what happened next wasn't planned, it wasn't scripted, and it would change his future forever.
By his teenage years, Pierce Brosnan had tucked away that spark from Goldfinger. It was still there,
buried in the back of his mind, but it wasn't his focus. Because Pierce had a different dream. He wanted to be an artist, not the kind who performs, but the kind who paints. At 16, he left behind the quiet towns of Ireland and made his way to London, enrolling at St. Martin's School of Art. He was inspired by greats like Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud. While his classmates enjoyed comfort, Pierce survived on toast and tea, sketching late into the night. His world was brushes, paints, and empty canvases waiting to be filled. Hollywood wasn't even a thought. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. In 1971, everything changed by pure chance. One afternoon, while wandering through the city, Pierce stumbled into a small theater workshop. Inside, a fire eater was rehearsing, practicing the strange art of breathing flames. Most people would have watched for a moment, maybe laughed, and walked away. But not Pierce. Something inside pushed him to try, and when he did, the room fell silent. The troupe saw it immediately, a presence, a weight, an intensity that came not from training, but from life itself. The hardships of his childhood had given him something rare, a quiet strength, an energy that couldn't be faked. From that moment, everything shifted. Acting was no longer a distant thought. It became a calling. He soon won a place at the Drama Centre London, one of the toughest acting schools in the country. The training was brutal. Half of his classmates dropped out, but Pierce stayed. Day after day, he endured. He studied Shakespeare. He trained in mime. He even mastered circus arts. At night, he worked odd jobs to pay his way. This wasn't about privilege or easy breaks. This was about survival. The hunger of a boy who had started with nothing and who had sworn he would never end with nothing. But here's the thing about ambition. It doesn't always pay off quickly. His first film role? Less than 30 seconds on screen, standing next to Elizabeth Taylor in The Mirror Cracked. His paycheck? Just £50. Another small part came in The Long Good Friday, alongside Bob Hoskins and Helen Mirren. Again, barely noticed. Inch by inch he was climbing, but he was still just another unknown actor in London. And then, in 1982, fate struck again. What was supposed to be a small background role in an NBC detective show turned into something far bigger. Overnight, Pierce Brosnan would go from struggling actor to a household name. Stay with me, because his big break would not only put him in front of millions, but it would also spark whispers that would follow him for more than a decade. This man is the next James Bond.
It's 1982. Pierce Brosnan is 29 years old, broke, and still mostly invisible in the acting world. He walks into an audition expecting nothing more than a background role in NBC's new detective series, Remington Steele. But something unexpected happens. The Bruisers take one look at him and change their minds. Instead of a bit part, they hand him the lead role. Just like that, Brosnan is thrust into the spotlight. When Remington Steele premiered, it wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. The series pulled in over 15 million weekly viewers, aired in more than 80 countries, and suddenly, Pierce Brosnan was a name on everyone's lips. His charm, his elegance, the way he slipped into the role of the smooth conman turned detective, it all seemed eerily familiar. Critics, fans, even casting directors began whispering the same thing. This man looks like James Bond. And in truth, they weren't wrong. By the mid-1980s, the James Bond franchise was looking for fresh blood. Roger Moore, who had held the role for years, was nearing the end of his run. Brosnan's name floated to the very top of the list. In 1983, fate dangled the opportunity right in front of him. While visiting the set of For Your Eyes Only, where his wife had a role, Bond producer Albert, or Cubby, Broccoli, reportedly said, "If he can act, he's my guy." It seemed destined.
Pierce Brosnan, the boy who once sat in a dark theater in Ireland dreaming of Connery's Bond, was about to inherit the tuxedo himself. But destiny has a cruel sense of humor. First, Roger Moore was convinced to return for one more Bond film, pushing Brosnan's chance aside. Then in 1986, when Moore finally stepped down, NBC revived Remington Steele at the very last moment. By contract, Pierce was trapped, forced to watch as his dream role went to his friend Timothy Dalton instead. The press called those years the Lost Bond years. For Brosnan, they were exactly that. Years of watching the role slip through his fingers, not once, but twice. Still, he didn't quit. He pushed forward with thrillers like The Fourth Protocol and cult classics like Nomads. He even leaned into the joke, starring in Diet Coke commercials in tuxedos, a playful wink at the Bond role that kept escaping him. But here's the question. How long can anyone wait for their dream? Would you hold on through rejection after rejection, or finally let it go? For Pierce Brosnan, the waiting game lasted over a decade. And then, in 1994, the call finally came. Stay with me, because when Brosnan finally became James Bond, the stakes were higher than anyone imagined. If he failed, the franchise itself might have died with him. The year was 1994. After more than a decade of near misses, disappointments, and heartbreak, Pierce Brosnan finally got the call. This time, there were no obstacles, no last-minute contracts, no revived TV shows to hold him back. At 41 years old, Pierce Brosnan was officially announced as the new James Bond. And the timing couldn't have been more critical. The franchise was fading. It had been 6 long years since the last Bond film, and critics whispered that 007 was outdated, a relic of the Cold War, destined to fade into history. The studio was gambling everything on Brosnan. If GoldenEye failed, James Bond might have died forever. But Pierce Brosnan delivered. From the very first frame, he was everything audiences wanted and more. Sophisticated, dangerous, elegant, the perfect blend of Sean Connery's toughness and Roger Moore's charm. His very first mission included a stunt so daring that the insurance company refused to cover it. A 220-meter bungee jump off a dam. Brosnan did it anyway. When GoldenEye hit theaters in 1995, it exploded at the box office. $353 million worldwide. A franchise resurrected. Bond was reborn, and Brosnan was hailed as the savior. Over the next 7 years, he starred in 3 more Bond films: Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day. Together, they grossed over $1.2 billion worldwide. For an entire generation, Pierce Brosnan wasn't just James Bond, he was James Bond. But success came with its own trap. Hollywood began to see him only through the lens of the tuxedo. Casting directors labeled him too Bond for other roles. Even Steven Spielberg once considered Brosnan for Indiana Jones, but the timing and image clash cost him the part. Still, Brosnan carried the role with pride, thinking he had secured it for years to come. He had risked his body, revived the brand, and become the face of one of cinema's greatest icons. But here's the twist. Just when Pierce Brosnan thought his legacy was secured, betrayal came from the very people who had entrusted him with saving the franchise. Stay with me, because what happened next wasn't just a career setback. It was a 47-second phone call that shattered his trust, stripped him of the role he loved, and left him reeling in a way no villain ever could. By 2004, Pierce Brosnan was on top of the world. 4 Bond films, over $1 billion at the box office. He had risked his life for stunts, carried the franchise on his shoulders, and proven himself as one of the most beloved 007s of all time. He believed his future as Bond was secure. But then, the phone rang. It lasted just 47 seconds. "You were a great James Bond. Thank you very much. Goodbye." No warning, no discussion. Just like that, the role that had defined his career was gone. Behind the scenes, Brosnan learned the truth. For nearly 2 years, producers had been auditioning replacements in secret. Even as they praised him publicly, they were already planning his exit. For Brosnan, it wasn't just the loss of a role. It was the shattering of trust. Imagine dedicating yourself fully to something, only to find out that the people you worked for had been plotting behind your back. And the fallout was immediate. 3 major film deals vanished almost overnight. His Hollywood salary, once as high as $12 million per film, collapsed to barely a fraction of that. Studios began labeling him Too Bond, so iconic that the image now became a prison. Instead of opening doors, it slammed them shut. Brosnan later admitted that this period was one of the darkest stretches of his life. His son remembered catching him in tears when the trailer for Casino Royale, starring Daniel Craig as the new Bond, played on screen. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was grief. The hollow ache of watching someone else step into the life you had built, knowing it was gone forever. For a man who had already survived childhood abandonment, poverty, and years of rejection, this betrayal cut deeper than critics ever knew. But here's the cruel twist. Hollywood's betrayal, as painful as it was nothing compared to what Pierce Brosnan was about to face at home. Because behind the fame, behind the tuxedo, was a love story that defined him, and a tragedy that would break his heart in ways no audience ever saw.
Long before Pierce Brosnan became James Bond, long before the red carpets and flashing cameras, there was Cassandra Harris. He met her in the late 1970s when his career was still uncertain and hers was already established. Cassandra was striking, elegant, and magnetic, the kind of woman who could light up a room without saying a word. She was also a mother of 2, raising her children Charlotte and Christopher from a previous marriage. Most young men might have hesitated, but not Pierce. He didn't see baggage, he saw family. He stepped in as if he had always belonged there. Cassandra's warmth, her wit, her resilience, they drew him in completely. They married in 1980, and 3 years later welcomed their son Sean. In family photographs from that time, Brosnan's smile isn't the polished charm of a movie star. It's the deep, grounded happiness of a man who had finally found home. He would later reflect, "I wasn't a father, I was just Pierce. And then I became Daddy." But happiness has a way of drawing shadows. In 1987, Cassandra began to feel a persistent fatigue, an ache she couldn't explain. At first it seemed like stress, maybe exhaustion. But the truth was far worse. The diagnosis? Ovarian cancer. For Pierce, it was as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. One moment life was ordinary, the next everything was consumed by hospitals, treatments, and the endless waiting that comes with uncertainty. For 4 long years, Cassandra endured relentless rounds of chemotherapy and surgery. The disease took her strength, her energy, and eventually her hair, but it could never take her dignity. She met every challenge with courage that left everyone in awe. Pierce called himself the quiet partner, always by her side, holding her hand through treatments, offering steadiness when no words could ease the pain. But inside, he was breaking. At home, little Sean, still just a boy, would sometimes put on a toy doctor's coat, carrying plastic stethoscopes, trying to treat his mother with imaginary medicine. It was innocent, sweet, and utterly devastating, because everyone knew pretend cures couldn't save her. Near the end, Cassandra spoke softly to Pierce, not about the illness, but about love, life, and the strange peace that comes when you stop running from the truth. One night she whispered, "Please, darling, don't worry. It's just a life coming to rest." On December 28th, 1991, just one day after their 11th wedding anniversary, Cassandra passed away. She was only 43 years old. Pierce was by her side, along with Charlotte and Christopher. Sean, only 8 years old, was in the house, but too young to understand the finality of that moment. The holidays had just passed, but the air in their home was heavy, still, unbearably silent. In the days that followed, Pierce moved like a man on autopilot. Funeral arrangements, comforting others, keeping the children steady when he could barely hold himself up. At night, when the house was quiet, he would walk the halls, stopping at each child's doorway, listening to the rhythm of their breathing, reminding himself that something, anything, was still safe. Grief didn't fade. It rooted itself into every part of his life. Even at the height of his fame, behind the perfect smile and the tailored suits, Pierce carried a private sorrow no camera could ever capture. But as devastating as Cassandra's death was, Pierce believed he had survived the deepest wound a man could endure. He thought no other blow could compare. He was wrong. Because decades later, tragedy would return. This time, not for his wife, but for his daughter.
For years, Pierce Brosnan carried the weight of losing Cassandra, believing nothing could ever compare to that kind of grief. But life wasn't finished testing him, because decades later, the same merciless shadow returned, not for his wife this time, but for his daughter, Charlotte. Charlotte was radiant, warm, kind, resilient. She carried her mother's grace in her smile, her steadiness in moments of chaos, her ability to comfort others with nothing more than a touch of her hand. To Pierce, she was not just his daughter. She was living proof that Cassandra's spirit had never really left. But deep within her, hidden in her DNA, was the same fatal shadow that had claimed her mother. At first, it was small things, a wave of fatigue, a vague ache, nothing that seemed urgent. But Pierce recognized the rhythm instantly. He had lived through it before. The dread in the air, the quiet before devastation. Tests confirmed what his heart already feared: ovarian cancer, the same illness, the same cruel enemy, striking again. Charlotte faced it head-on, just as her mother had. For 3 years, she fought. Surgeries, chemotherapy, endless hospital visits. Each treatment chipped away at her strength, but her resolve never wavered. Her anchor was her children, Isabella, just 15, and Lucas, only 8. They watched her fade the same way she had once watched Cassandra. A cruel mirror image, history looping with surgical precision. Charlotte didn't ask for pity. What she asked for was time. Time to show her children that love could outlast pain. Time to leave behind memories of courage, not just sickness. And so in June 2013, as her body weakened, she made a decision. She put on a white dress. She stood tall against the weight of her failing strength and married her partner, Alex. It wasn't just a wedding. It was defiance. A final declaration that love, not illness, would have the last word. 2 weeks later, Charlotte was gone. She was just 41. The symmetry was almost too cruel to comprehend. Cassandra had died at 43. Lucas, Charlotte's son, was 8, the same age Sean had been when Cassandra died. Isabella was 15, the same age Charlotte had been when she first learned her mother was sick. It was as if grief had a blueprint, etching the same wounds across generations with merciless precision. Pierce stood once more in the place no parent should ever stand, burying not just a daughter, but a future. In 2014,
at a Stand Up to Cancer event. He spoke publicly about it for the first time. His voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of decades of loss. He said, "I held the generous, strong, beautiful hand of my first wife, Cassie, as ovarian cancer took her life much too soon. And just last year, I held the hand of my funny, wonderful daughter, Charlotte, before she too died from this wretched, inherited disease." The room fell silent. There was nothing to add. For Pierce Brosnan, grief didn't fade, it multiplied. But the story doesn't end there, because even as life broke him, one person would step in and help hold the pieces together. Someone who would stand beside him through his darkest storms and remind him that love can survive even the cruelest symmetry of fate.
When Pierce Brosnan married Cassandra Harris, he didn't just gain a wife, he became a father to her two children, Charlotte and Christopher. And from the beginning, Pierce never used the word step. He adopted them both, gave them his name, and loved them as his own. With Christopher, the bond was instant. They shared laughter, stories, and even film sets. In the early years, Christopher often worked alongside him, carrying cameras, learning the rhythms of storytelling. To the outside world, they weren't stepfather and stepson, they were simply father and son. But when Cassandra passed away in 1991, something inside the family shifted. Charlotte leaned on Pierce. Sean, still a boy, clung to him for strength. But Christopher carried his grief differently, quietly, heavily. Over time, that grief turned inward. Struggles with addiction began to creep in, not as moral failings, but as battles with shadows that refused to let him go. What started quietly became harder to hide. Legal troubles followed, close calls, a spiral that seemed impossible to break. Pierce did everything a father could. He paid for rehab, he sat for long talks, he offered countless chances. Sometimes he just sat beside Christopher in silence, hoping that presence alone would pull him back. But addiction is a cruel enemy, and love, no matter how deep, can't always save someone who doesn't yet want to be saved. In a rare moment of honesty years later, Pierce admitted, "Christopher is still very lost. I know where he is, but he's having a hard life. He knows how to get out. He doesn't want to." There was no anger in his voice, just sorrow. The sorrow of a father who had run out of ways to rescue a son. Eventually, for his own survival and for the stability of the rest of his family, Pierce made the hardest choice a parent can ever make. He stepped back, not to cut ties, never to stop loving, but to love from a distance. Years passed. Christopher faded from the public eye. When he reappeared later, older and frailer, the change was stark. For Pierce, it was another kind of funeral, one without a ceremony. Because losing a child to death is agony, but losing them to life while they are still out there somewhere, breathing and walking, that is its own quiet devastation. And yet, even in this pain, Pierce never turned his grief into spectacle. On Father's Day in 2022, he posted a rare message naming all his children, including Christopher. A simple act, but one that spoke volumes. The love never left. It never will. But through all this heartbreak, losing Cassandra, losing Charlotte, and watching Christopher drift further away, Pierce still had someone by his side, a woman who would become his anchor, his shield, and the quiet miracle that kept him from breaking. By the early 1990s, Pierce Brosnan had endured more heartbreak than most men face in a lifetime. He had buried the love of his life, raised children through grief, and faced betrayal in Hollywood. For many, it would have been too much. But just when it seemed like the weight of loss might finally break him, love found him again. In 1994, at a beach party in Cabo San Lucas, Pierce met Keely Shea Smith, a journalist and environmentalist. She wasn't dazzled by the tuxedo, the fame, or the idea of James Bond. She saw the man, quiet, wounded, resilient. And he saw in her something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Keely didn't try to erase his grief. She didn't force joy into spaces where sorrow lived. Instead, she stayed. Through sleepless nights, through anniversaries that felt like open wounds, she simply stayed. Over time, Pierce realized that what she offered wasn't just companionship, it was survival. In 1991, the two married in a breathtaking ceremony at an 800-year-old abbey in Ireland. For Pierce, that day wasn't just a wedding. It was a declaration that love still had a place in his life, that after everything he had lost, he could still build something new. Together, they welcomed two sons, Dylan and Paris. For Pierce, fatherhood had always been his most important role, more important than Hollywood, more important than Bond. With Keely, he got to step into that role again, not as a replacement for what was gone, but as a continuation of love. Keely became his anchor, his shield. When Charlotte fell ill decades later, Keely held the family together. When Pierce was dragged back into the same nightmare he had faced with Cassandra, it was Keely who stood steady, unyielding, carrying him through the storm. But being in the spotlight brought new challenges. After the births of their children, tabloids targeted Keely's appearance with relentless cruelty. While others might have crumbled under the pressure, Pierce stood fiercely by his side. He dismissed the critics and defended her openly, saying, "I love every curve of her body. She is the most beautiful woman in my eyes." For him, loyalty wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. And in 2024, Keely made headlines of her own, not for her appearance, but for her strength. She revealed that she had lost over 100 pounds, not to silence critics, but to honor her health and her journey. Her words said it all. "My body has survived love, children, and sorrow. Now I honor it by moving forward stronger." For Pierce, it wasn't a revelation. He had always known her strength. The world was simply catching up to what he had cherished all along. He has often said of her, "She saved me. She gave me the will to keep going." Because with Keely, Pierce didn't find an escape from grief. He found the endurance to live with it. She never tried to fill the silence left by Cassandra or Charlotte. She simply showed him how to live alongside it, how to let joy exist even when sorrow never fully leaves.
After decades of heartbreak, betrayal, and survival, Pierce Brosnan could have chosen retreat. He could have disappeared quietly into private life, far away from the cameras, the headlines, and the constant reminders of what he had lost. But he didn't. Instead, he chose to rebuild. Not just his career, but his life, his identity, and his legacy. For nearly 2 decades, Pierce and Keely lived in their Malibu estate, a Thai-inspired sanctuary they built together around the year 2000. In 2020, they sold it for a staggering $100 million, a record-breaking deal for the area. Today, Brosnan divides his time between a coastal home in Malibu and their retreat in Kauai, Hawaii. But these aren't just houses, they're sanctuaries. Spaces filled with his own artwork, gardens he tends himself, and rooms echoing with the laughter of children and grandchildren. For Pierce, privacy is sacred. Family is everything. At 72, health is no longer something he takes for granted. He follows a careful diet, swims in the Pacific, walks the coastlines, practices yoga. Not to chase vanity, but to preserve strength, for family, for love, for the causes he supports. Creatively, he never stopped. Brosnan still accepts roles, though now with more selectivity. Sometimes it's a streaming thriller, sometimes a quiet indie drama. He no longer acts to prove himself. He acts because the stories matter to him. But his truest creative outlet isn't film at all. It's painting. Pierce first turned to painting in the darkest days of Cassandra's illness as a form of therapy. The canvases gave him a place to pour out pain that words could never capture. Today, his abstract works are exhibited, sold, and auctioned, often raising money for charity. Because for Pierce, life is no longer about accumulation. It's about contribution. As a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, he has championed children's rights and disaster relief. Alongside Keeley, he has supported Greenpeace, the Natural Resources Council, and countless environmental causes. Clean oceans, wildlife protection, climate justice. These are the missions that define him now. And above all, cancer awareness. In memory of Cassandra and Charlotte, Brosnan has spoken, fundraised, and donated tirelessly. Every word, every contribution, every brushstroke of his art carries their memory forward. Time, of course, has left its marks. Silver hair, a slower stride, a softer voice. But these aren't losses. They're evidence of a life fully lived. Public appearances are now rare and intentional, not for vanity, but for purpose. Not for spectacle, but for meaning. Because Pierce Brosnan's greatest legacy will never be a tuxedo, a gun, or a catchphrase. It will be resilience. The resilience of a man who turned heartbreak into strength, loss into love, and silence into art.
Pierce Brosnan's life has been a story of impossible contrasts. On screen, he was James Bond, smooth, unshakable, untouchable. The man who always had the perfect line, the perfect escape, the perfect ending. But off-screen, his life was anything but perfect. He survived abandonment as a boy. He fought his way up from obscurity. He waited more than a decade for the role his dreams, only to have it ripped away with a single phone call. He buried the love of his life. He buried his daughter. He watched his son drift away. And yet, he endured. Through love, through art, through fatherhood, through the quiet strength of Keeley Shea. He learned how to live with grief without letting it destroy him. He turned pain into resilience, loss into legacy. And that's the real Pierce Brosnan story. Not the spy, not the movie star, but the man who proved that even when life breaks you, you can still rebuild. Because true strength isn't about being untouchable. It's about carrying the wounds that never fully heal and choosing to keep moving forward anyway. So let me ask you this. Which chapter of Pierce Brosnan's story spoke to you the most? His fight for Bond? His love for Cassandra? Or his resilience after loss? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope can survive anything. And subscribe for more untold stories of resilience and legacy. In the end, Brosnan himself put it best. Life has to go on. And if it does, you better find something worth living for. For Pierce Brosnan, that something is no longer about escaping danger on screen. It's about family, love, art, and a legacy that reminds us all, even after loss, there can still be purpose.